Hey guys, it's Betty from BakerBettie.com and welcome back to another Ask Baker Bettie video. Now, if you missed my video from last week, I'm actually starting a new series here on my channel called Ask Baker Bettie, where I just sit down in my kitchen and I answer all of your questions about one specific baking topic. So last week, I answered a lot of questions about yeast, how it functions in baking, and different types of yeast. And now this week, I am going to be answering all of your questions about sugar. The reason I chose this topic this week is because I am going to be publishing a video about how to make marshmallows from scratch. And sugar is really one of the key ingredients for what makes a marshmallow a marshmallow. So I thought it would be a really good topic to tackle this week. And I asked you on Instagram to send me all of your questions about sugar, and I wrote them down and I'm going to answer them here today. Now, if you aren't already following me on Instagram, I am at Baker Bettie, and that is where I am going to be posting the topic for the upcoming week for you to ask me questions. So if you want to be involved in that, make sure you go follow me over there. And I also do lots of behind the scenes things and techniques, and you do see a little bit of my real life over there. So it's been a really great community and I hope to see you over there. Okay, so let's do a little brief overview of all of the things sugar does in our baking, because I think it does a lot more than you think it might. Now, the first and most obvious thing that sugar is going to do for us is to sweeten and add some flavor to our baked goods. Now, granulated sugar isn't going to add so much flavor as it does sweetness, but things like brown sugar are going to also add some flavor because of the molasses in the brown sugar. It's going to add some caramel and just deeper notes to our baked goods. Now, sugar is also going to help promote browning of our baked goods. So sugar obviously caramelizes when high heat is applied to it. So a baked good that has no sugar or a very small amount of sugar in it is going to brown much less in the oven than a baked good that has a higher ratio of sugar. Sugar is also going to help leaven our baked goods. So a perfect example of this is when you are creaming butter and sugar together. The purpose of that is to trap a web of air between the sugar and the fat, and that is going to help leaven your cookies or cakes or whatever you are using that creamed mixture with. So sugar is really a key ingredient in those circumstances for leavening. Sugar also holds on to moisture. So sugar is hygroscopic in nature, which means that it pulls in and holds onto moisture, which means that a baked good that is made with no sugar is going to stale much quicker than a baked good that's made with a high amount of sugar. And that's just because the sugar is really holding on to that moisture and keeping the baked good more moist and tender. And speaking of tenderness, sugar also helps to tenderize our baked goods. So because sugar is hygroscopic in nature, it is holding on to that moisture and actually leaving it less readily available for the flour to produce gluten with. So a baked good that's made with a high quantity of sugar is going to have a weaker gluten structure and therefore will be more tender than a baked good that's made with no sugar or very little sugar. So that is a very brief overview of all of the different things sugar does in our baking, but definitely check out that more detailed video if you want to learn even more. Okay, so now I want to answer all of the questions that you asked me on Instagram. I wrote them down and I will try my best to answer them. If you have another question that didn't get asked or didn't get answered here, definitely ask it in the comment section and I will do my best to answer it. So Jess asked me, I watch a UK baker who says caster sugar and icing sugar. Are these the same as granulated sugar and powdered sugar? So this is such a great question because people from other parts of the world are going to use different terminology for things than we use in America. And they're also going to have access to different ingredients than we have. So it's nice to know what you can substitute for different things or what different terminology is. So caster sugar is not exactly granulated sugar. It is actually closer to what we would call super fine sugar in the US. So super fine sugar is not super easy to find. It's not in every grocery store, but sometimes you can find it, and that is really the equivalent of caster sugar. And what that is it's sort of an in-between between granulated sugar and powdered sugar. It's granulated sugar that has been processed to a finer grain than actual granulated sugar. So castor sugar or superfine sugar are actually excellent things to use when you are making things that require whipping egg whites into a meringue. So something like pavlova or macarons. All of those things work really well with castor sugar or superfine sugar, but that's not to say that you can't substitute the two. If you see a recipe that calls for castor sugar, you can use granulated sugar and vice versa. But if you are making something that has a really delicate and light texture and it calls for castor sugar and you don't have access to it, you can actually take granulated sugar and put it in your food processor and give it a few pulses till it's a little bit of a finer grain, and then it's going to be a better substitute for you. Now, that's not to say that if you were to just use granulated sugar, it would be a disaster. You definitely can, but to give a more accurate substitute, you can process it to a finer grain. Now, icing sugar is the same thing as powdered sugar. So powdered sugar has quite a few different names. It's called powdered sugar, confectioner's sugar, icing sugar, 10x sugar. It has a lot of different names. Now what that is it is granulated sugar that has been processed down to a really fine powder, and then it has an anti-caking agent added into it, something like cornstarch, to just make sure that it doesn't clump up. So that's what all of those things are referring to. Okay, so Anne asked me, when substituting coconut sugar for granulated sugar, do you use the same measurements? So this is a great question because sugar serves so many purposes in our baking that you really need to be careful when you do substitute it for other types of sugar. So coconut sugar is actually going to be a better substitute for brown sugar than it is for granulated sugar, because it has similar properties. It is a more unprocessed sugar and is going to have those molasses notes to it, and it's a little more moist than granulated sugar. So that's not to say that you can't substitute it for granulated sugar, but it just serves as a better substitute for brown sugar because it's a little more similar in texture and flavor. Now, you can substitute one for one. I tend to think that coconut sugar tastes a little less sweet, so sometimes I usually add a little bit more. But I find that coconut sugar is going to function best in things that are a little more forgiving, something like a muffin or a quick bread like banana bread or zucchini bread, or cookies also can work well with coconut sugar. If you're wanting to make something that's a little less forgiving, something like a cake or like a marshmallow or a macaron or something that takes a little more technical skill, I wouldn't really recommend substituting coconut sugar. In fact, if you want to make something like that with coconut sugar, I would try to find a recipe that is specifically written to be made with coconut sugar. When I was a private chef, I actually used to make marshmallows for my client with coconut sugar, and I was able to find a recipe that was written specifically to be made with coconut sugar. Now, those marshmallows have such a different texture than a traditional marshmallow because that coconut sugar is more like brown sugar. They kind of always stay like a little bit wet. They never really set like a real marshmallow does. But as long as you're okay with understanding that it's not going to be like the traditional version, you definitely can. And there are so many bloggers out there that write recipes specifically utilizing those ingredients. So that is what I would recommend, is to try to find recipes that are specifically written to use that ingredient, because sugar does play such a crucial role in the texture, and you don't want to be wasting all of your ingredients kind of trying to play around with it and figure out what might work. Okay, so Haley asked me, why do some bread recipes call to add sugar to the yeast and liquid combination first to wake the yeast up, but some do not call for any sugar at all to activate the yeast? So that's a great question, and this is something that we addressed a little bit in the last Ask Baker Bettie video about yeast. So some bread recipes call for you to proof your yeast. And what that means is you are going to mix the dried yeast with the liquid in the recipe and a pinch of sugar. And what happens when you do that is The yeast is going to wake up with that liquid because it's in a dried state. It needs moisture to wake up. And then the sugar is going to give it something to start feeding on. So it serves two purposes. It's going to sort of jumpstart your yeast so that when you add it into your dough, it's really vigorous and active and awake. But also it's going to let you know that your yeast is definitely alive before you add it into your dough. So when you proof your yeast, you'll start seeing a lot of activity, a lot of bubbles forming, and that's just a little insurance policy to make you know that your yeast is alive. Now, this process is not necessary to make a bread recipe. In fact, the recipe that I posted last week for my 4-ingredient bread, we just mixed the yeast into the dry ingredients, we added our water in, and there's no sugar in the recipe at all. Now, yeast does need a food source to feed on, but that does not have to be in the form of granulated sugar. When flour is hydrated, it starts breaking down the starches in the flour and is going to start converting that into sugar that the yeast can then feed on. So yeast is going to have food in a bread dough, whether it has sugar in it or not. And yeast is going to wake up once it's hydrated, whether it was done separately from the bread dough or if it was mixed right into the bread dough, if that makes sense. So proofing your yeast is definitely a process that can make you know your yeast is alive and give you a little bit of a jump start so that your yeast is really active when it goes in the recipe. But it's not 100% necessary, and recipes are just written differently based on what they're trying to achieve and just sort of what the recipe writer prefers when they're making their bread. Okay, so Sarah asked me, when is the best time to put turbinado sugar on things like muffins or banana breads? It's either melted into the batter or it bounces right off. So I tend to put turbinado sugar or sanding sugar on top of cookies or muffins or scones before they go into the oven. But I find that you actually need quite a bit of sugar, like more of the turbinado sugar than you think you might, to make sure you're actually getting that crunchy texture. So if you do a light sprinkling over the top, chances are it actually is going to seem like it's sort of melted into the batter. You have to do a pretty liberal coating on it, or you're not gonna get that really nice crunchy effect. So I would say do it at the beginning, make sure you're using a good amount of sugar. If that still isn't working for you for some reason, like if you have a batter that's extremely wet and it's kind of sinking down in, you could definitely put your muffins in the oven, give them a few minutes, and then quickly add some on top while they're still raw but partially baked and see if that works. But I like to do it at the beginning, but just make sure you're using a good amount of sugar. Okay, and the last question I have is, how does natural sugar affect baked goods? So I'm not sure if this question is referring to specifically unprocessed forms of sugar, or if it's referring to things like honey and maple syrup and coconut sugar and things like that. So if you do want to use more natural forms of sugar, like honey or maple syrup, you can substitute them in certain baked goods. Like I addressed with the coconut sugar, it's typically better to do that with more forgiving baked goods. So a brownie, a muffin, a banana bread, those things tend to work better with those types of sugar substitutes. And an important thing to also keep in note is that honey and maple syrup are actually sweeter by volume than granulated sugar. So you want to typically do about 2/3 of a cup for every 1 cup of granulated sugar that you're substituting. But again, with this, since baking is a science, I would tend to work on finding recipes that are actually calling for the sweetener that you would prefer to use. So if you were to take my banana bread that uses granulated sugar and brown sugar and tried to swap it out for maple syrup or honey, it's possible that it would work well, but you're probably going to get the best results for a recipe that was specifically tested with that ingredient, if that makes sense. So I'm not a big fan of making swaps like that. Not that I'm not a fan of baking with those ingredients, but I just think that it just works better if it's specifically designed to be used that way. Now, I really hope you found this video informative. If you did, go ahead and give me a thumbs up. and I will be back in a few days with my how to make marshmallows video. Now, if you have never made marshmallows before, I really encourage you to try this. I really think you're gonna enjoy the process. And I actually used to think that I didn't like marshmallows, and that was just because I've never tried a homemade marshmallow. Homemade marshmallows are a whole new ballgame. They are so delicious and nothing like those store-bought kind. So I can't wait for you guys to see that video. I'll be back in a few days with it. If you aren't already subscribed, go ahead and hit that subscription button and ring the notification bell so you never miss a video. And if you're somewhere with this crazy winter polar vortex, please be safe. I'm in Chicago. We're getting like -20 degrees today. So be safe, stay warm, and I will see you guys soon. Bye.